Hi students. This video is to let you, or to just to demonstrate a little bit of how I might approach some of the analysis that you have to do for your poem presentation. So I'm just using this Shakespeare sonnet as an example because we've looked at it in class briefly and it's here in my Word document. So I'm just going to use it to let you know how I would look at phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics. Um, I don't know why, but I just like color coding things. As a graduate student in discourse analysis and linguistics, I color coded everything. I think my visual brain just sees things that way. You do not have to do it this way. You can do your analysis any way you like. You don't have to show me how you did your analysis. You just have to show me the outcome of it. But this is how I'm doing it to demonstrate. So I started with phonology. All the phonology stuff is in blue. And basically, I'm just reading through it, kind of looking for sound patterns that I notice. Pretty simple. The few things I notice are all of these plosives, right? So b, 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 bilabial, all voiced, and there's just three in the first two lines. But it was enough that it kind of stuck out to me. And later, when we talk about syntax, I point out that he doesn't have to start the whole sonnet and the sentence and the first line with but he chooses to. So it could be part of this pattern of the bilabial plosives here. As I read through the rest of the poem, I noticed that there's a whole bunch of voiceless fricatives and affricates. There's life, hath, this, which becomes voiced, and then back to interest. And then lots of sibilants like still with the shall stay. Moving on to the next line, thou reviewest this, thou dost. And it goes on that way. So I just highlighted some of those patterns. I suppose that could be intentional. Shakespeare did play around a lot with alliteration and sounds of language, but it could also just be an indication of the types of sounds and words that were really prominent at the time, at the very beginning of modern English. That would be a theoretical question I could potentially ask and choose to investigate. Okay, so then next I moved on to morphology, which is kind of the most exciting. Figuring out how words changed over time, or little bits of words changed over time, I think is one of the most interesting things about historical linguistics. So I'm interested in some of the word forms that are familiar to me, but slightly different than how we use them today. So this is early modern English. It's just coming out of Middle English. And instead of has, there's hath here. So I highlighted or I made purple the th because I'm interested in that morphological ending of the verb to have. I'm also interested in the est and st endings on some of these words. So I know the word review, but I don't necessarily know the word reviewist. I'm interested in this morphological ending, and I want to know if it's similar to the st ending on dost, like doest, or hast, or even lost down here. So we know the word lost now, and it's past tense, right? We don't say losed or losed. We say lost. And I guess I have some questions about if this is a form of a word that we still have, because it was really common back then at that time to put that st ending for past tense on other words. I'm probably going to look at the tense form throughout the entire poem just to see if it's all in past tense or not, and just try to pick up on some of those patterns there. For semantics, I would probably look up a couple of these words in the OED, especially dost and hath, just to see what exactly those words mean. I want to track them through time and see if it was the same in Old English and Middle English. Um, so that would satisfy some curiosity, and it would also satisfy, one or even three of the entries I have to make in the appendix using the OED. Okay, so that's interesting to me. You choose whatever is interesting to you and seems like a pattern in the poem that you have. Um, oh, one more thing that I think is pretty interesting. I highlighted the contractions here. Sorry, this is not a contraction. This is a possession. So this possession is interesting. Um, Possession looked different in Old English, and we've looked at that already a little bit in class. So I'm kind of wondering when the possession with this apostrophe occurred. Did it happen at the beginning of modern English, or is it maybe a spelling additive that the publishers, added later into modern English? Did Shakespeare actually use apostrophes? So I might just look that up in the OED and see as well. And then, of course, there's another apostrophe right here below it, remembered. So I've spent 2 years studying Shakespeare and text analysis in my undergrad. So I know some of these answers. Some of it has to do with meter, and some of it has to do with rhyme. Sometimes he would just write remembered, and sometimes he would write it or spell it differently and use an apostrophe. But I'm still interested in this morphological word form. So we have remember, and then we have remembered, the past tense. Question is, do we see other ed endings in early modern English, and can we find evidence of that in this poem here? So to me, that's an interesting question. I notice right away up here that there's instead of content, there's contented. And then at the very end of the body of the sonnet, there's another ed, remembered. So I think that that's interesting. But I'm a dork. You guys should be dorks too for this class. Okay, so next is syntax. I think the syntax of this poem is pretty interesting. I put all of it in green, especially items like this, which all seem to be adjuncts. So for syntax, that's what I focused on mostly in this poem is where are all the adjunct phrases? What can these sentences do without structurally? And then later I went through and I kind of looked at what do they do semantically. But since this is syntax, I'm only looking at the adjunct phrases that are structural. I also questioned this beginning the poem with a coordinator, but it doesn't really coordinate anything, right? Or it's not opposed to anything that's written. So we know but to be a word that shows some sort of opposition or thinking about a different thought. But the opposition and the different thought is opposed to something that's not here, right? Something that's come before. It would be during his life as opposed to after his life. And that's an interesting syntactic choice that Shakespeare made. Okay, so here are a few more adjuncts I just highlighted. And then I highlighted specifiers and their heads, I put in bold some specifiers and their heads. So semantically, we already looked this up in the OED during class, and we found out that it's an adjective, it modifies the arrest, and it means something awful, right? A terrible stop, like your heart stopping. Here, there's the better part, so another modifier, something that would go in the specifier position of this noun phrase. Here we have the dregs of life. So instead of having something in the specifier position, they made it a whole phrase with a prepositional phrase after it. So it's a noun phrase, dregs, and with a prepositional phrase after, of life. And then here's another one that's just the coward conquest. Coward being used as a modifier for conquest. the noun phrase. So the dregs of life seems to be the only one, at least the only one that I made bold, that changes that syntax form, right? So it changes it around from specifier and head to a whole phrase of its own. I found that to be interesting. These are the types of things that I'm looking for. You guys can look for whatever seems to appear in the poems that you have for syntax. Just think about what we learned about how sentences go together. Look at the phrases and the different types of phrases and how they're used, and just look for patterns. So finally, semantics. This is something we haven't gone over yet, just a little bit, but semantics has a lot to do with structure, just because one defines the other. Structure defines meaning, and meaning defines structure. But for semantics, this is really where you'll end up using the OED quite a bit. We already looked up fell. We were wondering what that meant, since we know it to be a verb. Without all bail, the question is, what does this adjunct phrase mean? I know what bail means, but I wonder when this word came to be. How old is it? We talked about hath in morphology. What does hath mean? Does it actually mean past tense? Is this th ending having to do with the pronoun? Who knows? But looking it up in the OED will help to answer that question. And then the sentence says, my life hath in this line some interest. So I'm curious about the word line. My guess, in knowing Shakespeare, is that it's a double entendre, which means it has a double meaning. There's the literal line. It says this line. So it could mean the whole poem. It could mean the line that came before it. It could mean in his poetry in general, that there's something interesting or of value in his poetry or in his writing or in the line that came up here. So I would look that word up and just see what all the possible meanings are, especially around the time that he was writing. Okay, so those are all the examples I have for this poem. I encourage you to get all this done as soon as possible. Let me bring up the assignment here. Start to go through your poem and do each of these things. For your appendix, remember you have to fill out these 4 items for 3 words. So the earliest forms, the etymology, so where it comes from, right? Where does it originate? The meaning, so the meaning in your poem, right? Not just any random meaning, but the meaning that you think applies to the poem you're looking at. And then the date of earliest use for the word in your meaning, the one in your poem. So maybe the earliest use of that meaning was Old English, maybe it's Modern English, I don't know, but the OED will tell you. Remember that there is an example appendix down here. This was done by a student who, this is all pretty straightforward, and the student did their capstone on historical linguistics, so they're basically just putting together a whole bunch of data. You can write yours up in paragraph form if you like, whatever makes the most sense to you. I want you to learn, so do what will help you learn. But there's the student's example here. Okay, please let me know if you have any questions at all. We can do like a Zoom class or something like that if that interests you guys. It doesn't have to be a class, it can be a tutoring session, and I can record it, and that way people who are far, far away, like Dean or Zipa, can watch the video. But please just email me, be in touch, let me know. You might need a few days to kind of settle into the online courses, but after that, let me know your needs, and I'll do my best to accommodate you. Good luck, everyone, and thank you.